There is a deeply unsettling paradox that most people who have been hurt by a narcissist are forced to confront. It is not the pain caused by their actions that lingers the longest, but the complete absence of any acknowledgement afterward. They leave, move on with their lives, laugh, build new stories, while you remain standing still with a quiet question looping inside you. Do they truly feel nothing, or do they know exactly what they did but never dare to say it out loud? From Carl Jung's perspective, this question cannot be answered through morality or by dividing people into good and bad, because what is operating here is not conscience in the usual sense, but a far deeper defense mechanism, primordial shame. Unlike guilt, which allows a person to say, "I did something wrong," shame strikes at the level of existence itself, whispering, "I am wrong," and for that very reason, it becomes a direct threat to the ego structure the narcissist depends on to survive. In Jungian psychology, the narcissist does not operate from the true self, but from the persona, a mask constructed to shield against inner emptiness and a pervasive sense of inadequacy. When they hurt you, there is a part of them that recognizes it as wrong, but that recognition is not permitted to enter consciousness. It is pushed down into the shadow, where everything intolerable is buried. In this context, admitting wrongdoing is not simply a moral act, but a psychological event capable of collapsing the entire persona, forcing them to face what they have spent a lifetime trying to escape. That is why they do not admit, do not apologize, do not turn back, to look not because you are unworthy of the truth, but because that truth poses a direct threat to their psychological existence. Once this is understood, the story no longer revolves around whether you receive an apology, but shifts to a much deeper level, recognizing that their silence is not proof of indifference, but the clearest sign that they lack the inner capacity to remain in the space of truth that the relationship itself brought into being. Part 1. Shame is not guilt. The greatest misunderstanding when dealing with a narcissist. The first and most important point that must be put back in its proper place is the distinction between guilt and shame, because most of your prolonged pain does not come from the narcissist's actions themselves, but from the fact that you unconsciously project your own emotional system onto a psychological structure that is entirely different. Guilt, the feeling of guilt, is a state that allows a person to look back at their behavior, distinguish right from wrong, and say, "I did something wrong," without collapsing their entire sense of self. It is tied to behavior, to morality, to the capacity for repair. Shame, however, is different. Shame does not speak about behavior, it speaks about being. It does not whisper, "I did something wrong," but far more harshly declares, "I am wrong. There is something fundamentally flawed about me." For this reason, shame does not encourage acknowledgement. It triggers a survival response. Within Carl Jung's analytical framework, shame is one of the emotions most easily pushed into the shadow, because if it were allowed to enter consciousness, the entire persona, the structure a person relies on in order to exist, would be threatened. A narcissist does not operate through guilt in the way you might hope, because they do not possess an ego stable enough to separate behavior from existential worth. For them, admitting wrongdoing is not a morally healing act, but a psychological collapse, a moment in which all efforts to construct an image, maintain control, and preserve self-esteem are at risk of disintegrating. Therefore, when you wait for them to take responsibility, to apologize, or at least to acknowledge the pain they caused, you are unconsciously asking for something that exceeds their inner capacity to tolerate. Not because they do not know what they did, but because naming that knowledge would force them to confront the primordial shame they learned to escape from very early in life. And it is precisely here that a painful paradox emerges. The more harm they cause others, the deeper the shame within them, and the deeper the shame, the lower their capacity to acknowledge it. This explains why the most severe acts of harm are often accompanied by the coldest forms of denial, because that psychological system is not designed to repair, but to avoid collapse. Once you understand this distinction, you begin to see that the right question is not, why don't they apologize? But rather, why have I placed my healing in the hands of someone who lacks the capacity to face the truth about themselves? Part 2. How shame is formed within the narcissistic structure. To understand why shame within the narcissistic structure is so destructive that it renders acknowledgement impossible, we must return to a very early point, not to excuse their behavior, but to clearly see how a psychological system is formed for the purpose of survival. The narcissist's shame does not emerge after they hurt you. It has existed long before that, like a smoldering underlying layer beneath all behavior, and the relationship with you is simply where it becomes most intensely activated. Within Carl Jung's analytical framework, when a child grows up in an environment where love is conditional, attention is withdrawn abruptly, or their emotions are minimized, shamed, or denied, the immature ego does not have the capacity to process the feeling of, I am not seen, or I am not valuable enough. Instead of integrating that pain into consciousness, the child is forced to push it down into the shadow, where intolerable parts are buried in order to survive. From this point on, the persona begins to form not as an ordinary social mask, but as a survival structure. One must be strong, must be right, must be special, must be superior, because the moment one stops, primordial shame will rise up and consume the entire sense of self. For this reason, shame in the narcissist is not a fleeting emotion, but a constant threat, always poised to shatter the image they cling to. When they enter a relationship with you, especially if you are someone with deep empathy, with the capacity to mirror and to perceive emotional layers others overlook, this structure begins to destabilize. Your presence inadvertently casts light on the voids they have worked so hard to conceal, not through accusation, but through closeness, authenticity, and an implicit demand for inner coherence. It is precisely here that shame no longer remains dormant in the shadow. It begins to be triggered by very small moments, when they hurt you and briefly recognize it, when they see disappointment in your eyes, when they realize they can no longer maintain a flawless image as before. But rather than allowing consciousness to approach these moments, the defensive system is immediately activated to push shame back into the shadow, while simultaneously reinforcing the persona, making it stronger, harder, more controlling. What is crucial to understand is that for the narcissist, the persona is not a choice, but a condition for survival. If the persona collapses, they do not possess a self stable enough to exist within their own inner world. Therefore, each time they cause harm and refuse to acknowledge it, this is not merely an act of avoiding responsibility, but a survival reflex designed to protect the psychological structure built very early on to avoid confronting primordial shame. Understanding this does not make the pain you endured any lighter, but it restores order to the story. You are not the reason they cannot acknowledge the harm, and the relationship did not fail because you asked for too much, but because you inadvertently touched a level of their inner world that they do not have the capacity to integrate. Part 3. Why acknowledgement is a lethal threat to the narcissist's persona. At the deepest level, what makes a narcissist unable to acknowledge wrongdoing does not lie in stubbornness or deliberate cruelty, but in a far more difficult truth to accept. For them, acknowledgement is equivalent to collapse. In Carl Jung's psychology, the persona is not merely a social image, but the framework that supports the entire ego structure when the true self is not strong enough to stand on its own. For an ordinary person, the persona can be flexible, adjustable, even temporarily set aside in moments of facing the truth. But for the narcissist, the persona is a psychological skin. If it is torn, there is nothing beneath it stable enough to replace it. When you expect an acknowledgement, you are unconsciously asking them to do the following: remove the mask, look directly into the shadow, and accept that the image of "I am right, I am good, I am special" is no longer intact. For a psychological structure built entirely on the avoidance of shame, this is not a moral act, but a survival shock. That is why the moment consciousness lightly touches the possibility of "I may have done something wrong," the defensive system immediately shifts into emergency mode, and the truth is distorted before it can even be named. The narcissist does not lie in the deliberate way you might imagine. They restructure reality in the very moment it appears, because allowing the truth to exist for even a brief time would allow primordial shame to rise and shatter their entire sense of self. This is why they do not merely remain silent, but also deny, blame, or rewrite the story with such certainty that you begin to doubt your own memory. In their inner logic, protecting the persona is more important than protecting the truth, not because the truth lacks value, but because it is too dangerous. The deeper the harm they cause, the more threatened the persona becomes, and the more extreme the defensive response. This is why the actions that hurt you most are often accompanied by the coldest denial, as if nothing needs to be said. Here, a very subtle distinction is necessary. The narcissist does not always not know what they have done, but rather cannot allow that knowledge to remain in consciousness long enough to become acknowledgement. Everything happens much faster at the unconscious level, where truth barely begins to form before it is twisted into another story, one in which they are still the misunderstood one, the betrayed one, or the one forced to act as they did. And when you try to pull them back to reality, when you ask for recognition of your pain, you inadvertently become a threat to the very structure they depend on to survive. Not because you are wrong, but because your presence places them before a choice they do not have the capacity to make. Either face the shadow and allow the persona to collapse, or protect the persona by sacrificing the truth. They always choose the second option. Understanding this, you begin to see clearly that their silence and denial are not a victory of power, but the signs of a psychological system trapped in the fear of disintegration. And it is precisely here that the story shifts away from the question, "Why won't they acknowledge it?" toward a more painful yet liberating realization. Not everyone has the capacity to endure the truth about themselves. Part 4. When shame cannot be tolerated, it turns into an organized system of attack. When shame cannot be acknowledged and cannot be integrated, it does not disappear, as many people mistakenly believe. Instead, it transforms into a highly defensive chain of reactions in which attacking others becomes the only way for the narcissist to continue existing without having to face themselves. This is the crucial point that helps you understand why, after the initial harm, you are not only abandoned in silence, but are then pulled into a second phase that is often even more painful: being smeared, having roles reversed, being assigned blame, and ultimately being turned into the cause of everything that happened. From Carl Jung's perspective, any psychological content pushed into the shadow carries an inherent pressure to return to consciousness. And when an individual lacks the capacity for self-reflection, the easiest way to release that pressure is through projection. The narcissist cannot tolerate the shame that arises when they recognize, even for a moment, that they have hurt you, because that feeling poses a direct threat to the image they cling to. As a result, they do not hold the shame within themselves. They throw it outward, place it onto you, and by doing so, they temporarily regain a sense of inner stability. This process, however, does not occur randomly or impulsively. It is often organized into familiar tactics, repeated with frightening precision. They begin by blurring reality. What you remember is labeled a misunderstanding. What you feel is dismissed as too sensitive, and your pain is reduced to an overreaction. When you try to explain yourself, they escalate by reversing roles, turning themselves into the victim while casting you as the one who is harmful, selfish, controlling, or ungrateful. If that is still not enough to soothe the shame within, they expand the battlefield outward, retelling the story to others in a carefully edited version in which every detail unfavorable to them is removed, and every reaction of yours is stripped of its original context and turned into evidence against you. This is when you begin to experience a deeply painful paradox. The more deeply you are hurt, the more you are accused of being the one who caused harm. The more you withdraw to protect yourself, the more you are labeled cold, cruel, or lacking humanity. This does not happen because you acted wrongly, but because shame that cannot be endured internally needs an external place to reside. And you, given your shared history and strong capacity for mirroring, become the ideal target. Once you are pushed into that role, you are no longer seen as a human being with emotions, memories, and boundaries, but as a container, a screen onto which they project everything they cannot tolerate within themselves. This explains why the accusations you receive often carry an extreme intensity, wildly disproportionate to your actual behavior, and why they so often strike at your deepest fears. They are not the truth about you, but the intensity of the shame being expelled from them. At this stage, the narcissist is no longer merely avoiding acknowledgement, but actively reconstructing reality in order to protect the persona. They rewrite the timeline, erase the moments when they hurt you, magnify your minor mistakes, and construct a narrative in which they were forced to act as they did because you made them become that person. Unquote. This attack is not aimed at repair, dialogue, or mutual understanding, but at creating a safe distance between themselves and their own shadow, a distance in which shame can be kept just low enough not to collapse the image they depend on to survive. What makes this entire process especially damaging is that it often unfolds with a cold persuasiveness, because the narcissist does not lie with hesitation or doubt. They believe in their new story the very moment it is created, because that belief is the only thing preventing their psychological system from disintegrating. When you try to explain, clarify, or hope they will reflect, you are not only rejected, but perceived as a threat, because your presence brings shame closer to consciousness than they can tolerate. And if you have ever wondered why your silence sometimes makes them angrier, more restless, or more aggressively escalating than direct confrontation, the answer lies here. When you do not react, do not argue, and do not participate in the story they have constructed, shame no longer has an external place to hide, and it begins to turn back toward where it originated. It is at this point that many people first see the true nature of what is happening. Not a personal battle, not deliberate malice, but a defensive loop in which every attack directed at you is, in truth, a desperate attempt to flee from themselves. Part 5. Why your silence becomes unbearable for them. When you withdraw into silence, what occurs is not merely the absence of a reaction, but a rupture in the familiar operating rhythm of the narcissist's psychological structure, a structure in which their sense of self has always been maintained through continuous interaction with others. Through Carl Jung's lens, the persona does not exist as an independent entity. It lives off an unbroken stream of feedback from the surrounding environment. It requires validation through attention, through being seen, through others responding according to the role it demands. As long as you remain caught in cycles of explaining, defending yourself, or trying to be understood, you are unconsciously keeping that mechanism in motion. But when you become fully silent, not silence as a pause or a tactic, but silence as a way of being, the entire system loses its familiar support and begins to wobble. What they cannot tolerate is not that you say nothing, but that you no longer provide the data they need to locate themselves within reality. This silence creates a deeply uncomfortable psychological lag. They no longer know where they stand in the story, no longer feel certain that their role as the victim or the one who is right is still being sustained. And most importantly, they no longer experience their own existence through you. Within that gap, the reactions you may observe are often more exploratory than genuinely emotional. Indirect signals, half measures, behaviors that resemble testing the signal to see whether you are still there, still responsive, or have truly withdrawn. When no response arrives, they begin to experience a form of nameless anxiety, subtle at first, not immediately explosive, but persistent and corrosive to their sense of control. This is the point at which many narcissists shift to more refined strategies, not to restore the relationship, but to regain the feeling that they still have influence. Appearing in indirect spaces, invoking the past in vague ways, or creating new narratives with the sole purpose of seeing whether you are still watching. If those efforts also fall into silence, some escalate by manufacturing drama not because of an emotional overflow, but because drama is the fastest way to pull another person back into the role of mirror. And if even drama fails, the final option is often total disappearance, not as a healthy letting go, but as an emotional freeze designed to avoid confronting the void your silence has opened. What must be emphasized here is this: your silence does not trigger longing in the sense of mature attachment. It triggers existential disorientation, a state in which they no longer know who they are without another person's reaction. For this reason, your silence does not need to be maintained as a strategy, because it is not an outward-facing action, but the natural consequence of having withdrawn your energy to where it truly belongs. At the deepest level, what they cannot endure is not losing you, but losing the support that sustained an image that was never capable of standing on its own. And when you see this clearly, you begin to understand that silence is not an absence demanding explanation, but a psychological boundary where you stop serving as the foundation for another persona's existence, and for the first time, stand fully within the inner space of your own self. Part 6. Why you do not need the acknowledgement to be free. There is a very subtle, yet decisive turning point in your healing journey. The moment you realize that your recovery has been bound to something that was never truly yours to begin with, the capacity of the person who hurt you to face what they did. For a long time, you may have believed that if they would just acknowledge it, if there were only one apology that felt sincere enough, everything would fall back into place. Your pain would gain meaning, and the story would finally close. But from Carl Jung's perspective, this is a deeply human yet dangerous illusion, because it places the authority to define your inner reality in the hands of a psychological structure that lacks the capacity to tolerate the truth. When you wait for acknowledgement from a narcissist, you are unconsciously remaining within the orbit of their persona, where your value is still suspended on their reactions, their words, or their silence. This is not weakness. It is the natural consequence of having connected genuinely, invested emotionally, and believed in the possibility of repair. Yet, at a certain point, you begin to see clearly that even if an apology were to appear, it would not take the form you need. It would either be strategic, designed to restore control, or hollow, lacking shadow integration, and incapable of producing real change. It is precisely here that a difficult but liberating realization begins to take shape. The truth does not require validation from someone who cannot endure it. Jung described this process as the withdrawal of projection, when you stop granting another person the authority to define your emotions, your memories, and your sense of existential worth. Instead of continuing to direct your energy toward them, you begin to bring it back inward, no longer allowing their denial or acknowledgement to determine whether your pain was real. This does not mean denying your suffering or rationalizing what happened. It means you stop waiting for recognition from a place that cannot generate truth. When you no longer need them to say, "I did something wrong," in order to know that you were hurt, you step out of the psychological loop in which their shame was once processed through you. And the paradox here is that the very moment you no longer need that acknowledgement, its power over you disappears. Not because they have changed, but because your psychological system no longer depends on whether they are capable of facing their own shadow. Part 7. Two psychological paths that no longer intersect. The integrated shadow and the fled shadow. When you no longer wait for acknowledgement, an invisible yet decisive boundary is established. And at that boundary, two psychological paths begin to fully diverge. In Carl Jung's view, psychological maturity does not come from avoiding the shadow, but from the capacity to remain with it long enough to integrate it. On your side, this process unfolds quietly. You look back at what happened, endure the pain without distorting it, allow emotions to exist without needing to fix them immediately, and through this, the parts of yourself that were once abandoned are gradually reclaimed. Your shadow, once seen, becomes a source of understanding. It no longer needs to attack, project, or seek refuge outside itself. On the narcissist side, however, the only path they know is continued flight. The shadow is not integrated, but driven away. And each time this happens, the persona must be reinforced, stronger, harder, further removed from reality to maintain protection. This creates a developmental paradox. The deeper you go inward, the quieter and clearer you become, while they grow increasingly reactive, restless, and dependent on external structures to maintain a sense of existence. The two systems no longer share a common inner language, because one learns to tolerate truth, while the other survives by avoiding it. For this reason, at a certain point, no further actions are required, no additional explanations, no final conversations. The difference lies in the operating structure itself. You do not move forward to surpass them, nor do they fall behind in a moral sense. Each person simply moves within the limits of their psychological capacity. And what makes this separation final is not anger or dramatic closure, but a form of calm that is almost impossible to reverse. You can no longer return to living within a system that requires you to carry another person's shame. Once your shadow has been seen and integrated, you are no longer compatible with structures that survive through denial. And at that point, the bond does not break in an emotional sense, but quietly falls away in a structural one. At the deepest level, the conclusion of this journey is not victory or revenge, but complete system separation, where you move forward with a rare and enduring sense that nothing within you needs to be proven to someone who lacks the capacity to endure the truth about themselves. Part 8. When you stop carrying someone else's shame, inner sovereignty is restored. There is a very quiet yet decisive moment when you realize that the heaviest burden you once carried was not memory, not sadness, but shame that never belonged to you. In a relationship with a narcissist, you unconsciously became the container for what they could not tolerate within themselves. The feeling of having done wrong, the sense of destruction, the sense of not being enough. And when the bond ended, what left you exhausted for so long was not their absence, but the habit of continuing to carry that burden for them, questioning what you did wrong, what you lacked, where you were not patient enough or loving enough. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment when the final withdrawal of projection must take place, not only your projection onto them, but the withdrawal from an entire psychological system that once compelled you to take responsibility for another person's emotional life. When you stop carrying that shame, a new order is established. What belongs to them returns to them, and what belongs to you is restored to its rightful place. This does not happen through an act of forceful will, but through a deep exhaustion with living in a role that no longer fits. You do not need to forgive in a moral sense, nor do you need to close the story with a graceful ending. The liberation here is structural. You no longer react automatically when you think of them, no longer need to correct the story in your mind, no longer feel pulled into proving the truth of your experience. At this stage, silence is no longer a strategy, but the natural state of a system that has regained its axis. And the paradox is this: it is precisely when you stop trying to escape the pain, stop trying to understand them further, stop waiting for acknowledgement, that the story truly closes from the inside. Not because they changed, but because you are no longer the place where what they cannot bear can take refuge. At the deepest level, Part 8 marks the most important transformation of the entire journey. A shift from living within the orbit of another persona to standing firmly within your own inner life, where truth does not require anyone's validation, and your worth is no longer suspended on another person's capacity to face themselves. Part 9. The real end does not happen in them, but at the point where you stop waiting. There is a quiet yet conclusive truth that very few people recognize in this journey. The story does not end when the narcissist realizes something, but when you no longer wait for them to realize anything at all. From Carl Jung's perspective, much of human suffering does not arise from the original experience itself, but from the unconscious clinging to a capacity that never truly existed, and in this relationship, that capacity was the other person's ability to face the truth about themselves. As long as you are waiting for a moment of understanding, a moment when they look back, a sign that they feel shame or regret, you remain within a psychological space where the value of truth still depends on their awareness. But at a certain point, not because you have become stronger, but because you have become deeply, profoundly tired, you begin to let that question go. There is no longer, do they know, or do they feel anything? Because those questions no longer have relevance to how you live from this moment forward. This is when the real ending occurs, not dramatically, not through declarations, not sealed by forgiveness or anger, but through a complete withdrawal of psychological energy. You no longer return to the old story to revise it in your mind, no longer need to prove that you were right, no longer need to hold the role of witness to what happened. And the paradox is that it is precisely when you stop waiting for acknowledgement that the truth finally stands firmly within you, no longer shaken by whether the other person has the capacity to see it or not. At the deepest level, Part 9 is not about getting over the narcissist, but about stepping out of a structure in which truth once required external validation. When that happens, the bond loses its pull, not because you cut it, but because there is nothing left in you that needs to stay and wait. And it is at this point that the story closes in the most sustainable way possible. Not because someone else changed, but because you no longer place your inner life in the hands of someone who never had the capacity to endure the truth about themselves. Part 10. What remains after everything? When silence becomes a form of maturity. When this entire journey comes to an end, what occurs is neither a moment of illumination, nor a feeling of victory or transcendence over someone else, but a kind of silence entirely different from any silence you have known before. It is no longer the heavy silence of waiting, not an empty space filled with unanswered questions, nor a restraint meant to avoid conflict, but a state in which your mind no longer automatically returns to the old story in search of a final confirmation. In the spirit of Carl Jung, this is the sign that a psychological cycle has closed properly, not because the issue was resolved externally, but because it no longer needs to be resolved within your inner life. You begin to see that for a long time, what kept you stuck was not the narcissist's behavior, but your unconscious loyalty to an idea. That truth could only stand if the one who caused the harm was able to acknowledge it. When this idea dissolves, not through logic, but through lived experience, a new order forms naturally. You no longer need to reinterpret the past to make it more coherent, no longer need to compare your version of the story with the one they tell others, and no longer feel compelled to defend your dignity or your correctness. This does not happen because you forget the pain, but because the pain has been placed where it belongs. It becomes a datum of memory, no longer the center of identity. At this stage, you begin to clearly sense the difference between understanding something and having to live around it. You may understand very well the narcissistic structure, the mechanics of shame, persona and shadow, but that understanding no longer pulls you back into the relationship on an emotional level. This separation is the true ending, because it occurs at the level of psychological energy where you no longer invest attention, no longer pour vitality into thinking for, feeling for, or carrying the burden for another person. And the deepest paradox is this: when you no longer need their acknowledgement, no longer need them to feel shame or regret, their image within you naturally diminishes, not because you force it to, but because there is no longer any inner reason for them to occupy that space. You enter a form of undefended silence, where you can be alone without feeling empty, can remember the past without being pulled back into old emotions, and can look at who you once were in that relationship without judgment or self-blame. Part 10 does not aim to offer encouragement or promise quick healing, but closes with a mature and irreversible realization. You do not need another person's awakening in order to live truthfully with yourself. And when this becomes evident in every thought and every emotional reflex, silence is no longer the emptiness of loss, but a space wide enough for you to begin an inner life no longer governed by what others can or cannot face. When the story reaches this point, there is a truth that needs to be put back in its proper place, not to comfort you, but to restore order to everything you have lived through. What has never truly mattered is whether the narcissist feels shame, whether they realize what they have done, or whether one day they will acknowledge it. All of those questions, though deeply human and entirely legitimate, revolve around the same old center, placing the authority to conclude the story in their capacity to face reality. And it is precisely there that pain lingers longer than necessary. From Carl Jung's perspective, true psychological maturity does not occur when another person changes, but when you withdraw the projections you once placed upon them, including the projection that they possess the capacity to endure the truth in the way you hoped. When you understand the mechanisms of shame, persona, and shadow, you begin to see the entire sequence of events not as a personal tragedy, but as a collision between two psychological systems operating by entirely different principles. On one side is the effort to flee shame through denial, attack, and control. On the other is the capacity to remain with the truth, however painful, in order to integrate it and move forward. These two paths cannot meet, not because of a lack of love or goodwill, but because of structural limits. And when you stop waiting for them to see, acknowledge, or regret, what occurs is not loss, but the return of definitional authority to yourself. You no longer need them to confirm that you were hurt. Your pain does not require the signature of the one who caused it in order to be real. Nor do you need them to feel shame for the story to be complete, because the most enduring closure always happens at the point where you no longer place your inner life in the hands of another person's capacity to face themselves. At that point, silence no longer carries the tone of avoidance or defense, but becomes the natural state of a system that has regained its axis. You are not silent so that they might understand. You are silent because there is nothing left within you that needs explaining. And it is precisely here that shame, the burden once thrown onto you, no longer has a place to reside. It returns to where it belongs, not as punishment, but as the inevitable consequence of you no longer carrying another person's inner weight. This ending is not loud, nor does it resemble victory or dramatic justice, but it carries a rare quality, stability that requires no proof. You move forward not because they have understood, but because you have understood enough not to remain, and that is the moment when inner sovereignty ceases to be a concept and becomes the way you live each day.